Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Biospace event, aligning with the FDA on a regulatory pathway to avoid decision day surprises. During the next hour, we'll discuss best practices for aligning with the FDA to accelerate the development of therapies for rare diseases. We're going to get started in just a moment, but just a few notes before we begin. Attendee phones are in listen-only mode. Questions are welcome. We'll leave 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, but you can submit them anytime, and we'll do our best to get to them. Questions are anonymous to other attendees. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a link following the event should you want to share it or review it after. If you're not very familiar with Biospace, we are the leading news and career site in biopharma with over 1 million monthly visitors and hundreds of thousands of subscribers. We have 2 podcast shows, The Weekly, featuring our news team discussing the biggest stories of the week, and also Denatured, which does deep dives into big picture issues and topics impacting our industry. We also have a bunch of free newsletters that you can sign up for on biospace.com. You can hit the subscribe button in the top right corner. And we also release regular reports on labor market trends, compensation, benchmarking, branding, and much, much more. I'm Heather McKenzie, a senior editor at Biospace, and your moderator for today. So on with the show. During the past several months, biopharma companies have been dealing with considerable change at the FDA. Among other challenges, executives at small and medium companies have reported communication challenges and some misalignment in terms of expectations while attempting to get their rare disease drugs across the regulatory finish line. So we will discuss that today. And we have an all-star cast. We have an all-star panel for you today. And I'm delighted to introduce them. Stacy Frisk is Executive Director of the Rare Disease Company Coalition, which is the leading voice for rare disease innovators. Prior to that role, Stacy was Director of Regulatory Strategy at Sarepta Therapeutics and has more than a decade of experience spanning industry, patient advocacy, and clinical research. Rahul Gupta is President of GATC Health, where he leads the company's work applying AI and multiomics to accelerate drug discovery and development. In his previous role, Rahul served as director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, the first physician to hold this cabinet-level role. Linda Marben is CEO of Capricor Therapeutics, a biotech company developing novel medicines for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and other serious diseases. Capricor currently has a BLA before the FDA for deramiocel for DMD cardiomyopathy. And Matthew Winton is Chief Commercial and Business Officer at Servomed, which is a clinical stage company developing therapies for age-related neurologic disorders. Prior to that, he was COO at Inozyme Pharma, where he played a key role in the company's successful acquisition by BioMarin Pharmaceuticals. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Like I mentioned, the FDA has thrown a few surprises our way in the past year or so, and we're going to get into that today. We're going to look into how we can possibly bridge the disconnect, because it's clear from recent guidance that the FDA and companies are on the same page. All right. So without further ado, first question. Has there been a shift in the FDA during the past year in terms of requirements and expectations compared to the previous 2 to 5 years? And Rahul, I'll throw that question over to you first.
Well, thank you, Heather, and again, thanks to you and as well as Biospace and my colleagues here for this fascinating conversation. I think when we ask about that, and my role in being previously collaborated directly with the FDA, on a number of regulatory frameworks. And currently, I've observed a meaningful acceleration in the agency's willingness to embrace evidence modernization. But of course, we can't look at the go without looking at the obvious, which is the recent leadership transitions that have introduced real, genuine uncertainty about how consistently those commitments are being applied. So, when we get to the program level, so the shift isn't purely regulatory, it's also structural. Staff reductions and reorgs and all of those things do create friction in these sponsor to FDA communications. And, it didn't exist to this level. You asked about the last 2 to 5 years. It wasn't at that level. They always exist, but, not at that level. And at the end of the day, these small and mid-sized rare disease companies are bearing the brunt of it. So for my time at the White House coordinating 19 federal agencies, I know that institutional transitions create policy ambiguity, even when the intent is aligned. But the challenge right now is translating that FDA's stated direction into actual, predictable, and operational guidance for sponsors. Now, at GATC Health, as you mentioned, we are seeing firsthand how AI-driven drug discovery is moving faster than the regulatory frameworks themselves, and they can accommodate. And that's what makes this the current moment both an opportunity, but also a risk for companies who are trying to develop timelines for their plans. So I think there is a positive shift. I think there's a growing recognition that that the 21st century tools require 21st century standards of evidence. And the question now is whether that recognition survives the current organizational disruption.
Okay. Maybe one of the other companies can jump in here. Linda or Matthew.
Yeah, so thanks. I'm very rarely rendered speechless, but that was so beautifully stated, Dr. Gupta. I really just think that you said it perfectly, that the change is hard, change is happening, change is necessary, and I really look forward to watching the FDA come to fruition with some of the ideas and standards that they've been talking about bringing to light. Some of the ideas that we do need to shake it up a little bit, revisit some of the ways that drugs have been approved, look at rare disease differently, and some of the CMC requirements as well. But in addition to that, understand that change is going to take time. They did go through a lot with a lot of risks. So they're operating with lower staff and less experience in some cases. So we at Capricorn are excited with our path forward. We feel that our response to the CRL was appropriate, and we now have a new PDUFA date, and we're looking forward to seeing that move to approval rapidly and with the collaboration of the agency.
Well, good luck with that, Linda. I've been covering that drug, deramiocel, and I'm looking forward to seeing that approved.
Me too.
And if I can just add, I do think we're in a unique period where the science is moving extremely fast, and the innovation that these companies, small rare disease companies, medium-sized companies, are bringing forward is just outpacing policy. And, I think that's something that we're seeing an acknowledgement by the agency. I think we are seeing acceptance of new ways to modernize and to understand and to evaluate these new technologies, be it AI focused or be it, new gene therapies or gene editing therapies. But there's always going to be a little bit of a rub when science moves so quickly for a large agency like the FDA to catch up. And to have the experts there that are needed to make those decisions. I think everybody has the best intentions, and everybody wants to see these amazing drugs being approved and these amazing technologies increasing clinical outcomes and being able to be used in clinical trials going forward. It's just finding that right balance and finding the right people that understand that within the agency to work with, innovative companies that are bringing these drugs forward.
Well, thank you, Matthew. We will get to the complexity of science and drug development in a second. But Stacy, you might have a broad view on how things have gone the past year compared to the past 4 or 5 years, maybe.
Yeah, sure. And so thank you, Heather, and thank you to the Biospace team and my fellow panelists for this great conversation. And so I think when we look at what's going well, FDA leadership, as my panelists have shared, have articulated a very clear vision for rare disease, focusing on creativity, common sense approaches. And so some of the remarks from leadership have been very encouraging. And you look at the rare disease evidence principles, the rare disease innovation hub strategic agenda, and a clear focus on intent to make rare disease drug development more efficient. And at the same time, I would be remiss to not mention, I'm sure many of your viewers are aware that these diseases are often serious. Many are irreversibly progressive. And so patient communities every single day is a day that their families, that patients themselves continue to degenerate. And it's behooves us all to move with all of the urgency possible. And at the Rare Disease Company Coalition, we exist to represent the small to mid-sized companies that are doing the hard work to solve some of these big scientific challenges. And Congress, I think, has done a great job in creating a lot of statutory authorities to speed drug development and has made very clear their intent to speed rare disease drug development. And so I think a theme that my fellow panelists have drawn here is that carrying forward the clear leadership directive at FDA to make rare disease drug development really not only efficient, but really centered around the urgency of the patient communities is really important. I think when we look at the numbers, though, the landscape is a bit mixed. And back in 2025, CBER approved just 5 orphan drugs and issuing 4 complete response letters. And so that's about 44% of decisions resulted in a CRL, which is a bit higher than the roughly 10% we see as an average in the past prior years. And this year, it's still very early. I don't believe that CBER has approved any orphan products, but has issued 2 CRLs. With CDER, they've approved 4 products, including yesterday the approval from Denali in Hunter syndrome, which is a really critical milestone. And I was really pleased to see as well that Commissioner Makary highlighted that the decision is proof that the agency is exercising flexibility while still maintaining the standards with their substantial evidence standards. So I think we're seeing some encouraging signals. And as my panelists pointed out, it's about translating that policy and leadership direction into practice.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Yeah, that Hunter approval was terrific to see. It was good that there were 2 shots on goal with Hunter early this year. So I promise we get back to complexity. So rare disease development is obviously extremely complex, is the word. What has the FDA gotten right, and what have they gotten wrong in the past year or so? Stacy, if you don't mind, starting with you again, you can have a sip of water if you'd like.
Happy to continue. So one thing that has been very exciting and going back to leadership direction is the openness that's been signaled to alternatives to the classic randomized controlled trial. That's so very important in rare disease, where often it's just a mathematical reality that achieving statistical significance in the context of an RCT is either going to be infeasible or it's going to take decades. And as I mentioned, patients with these diseases don't have days to wait, let alone decades. So the openness that's been shown to looking at alternatives is really encouraging. And particularly remarks from Commissioner Makary last year around pairing gold standard science with common sense in the context of our rare disease, where you can use an alternative to an RCT in many cases. So that was really encouraging. But I think at the same time, sponsors in this environment, there is a degree of uncertainty about how FDA will and when they'll apply these alternative methods. And so the implication is that we as sponsors and those in the investor community, researchers, et cetera, can't anticipate whether the agency is going to accept a given approach, a historical control, a biomarker, a novel design, et cetera. It may make them more hesitant to invest or continue development in that condition. And so we really just need a sponsor's clarity to see a path forward in these cases where an RCT is just never going to be workable. So if I had to pick one area, that could be an interesting one.
Okay, thank you.
I think Stacy's point about sort of the openness and willingness to listen, I think is an important one. I think there's been a lot of advocacy and a lot of understanding that rare disease is different. And ultra rare is even, harder to run randomized clinical trials in. And, it doesn't mean that it's less rigorous science or that we're, trying to have an easier pathway to approval, but you have to use a common sense approach that rare disease is different. You can't run a 500-person trial because that may be all the patients in the world. So you have to find, ways to work together to find, ways to get new therapies for these patients where in many cases no therapies exist, approved. And things like the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, are a great start. And listening sessions with patients so they truly understand kind of what these families and these communities are experiencing are also great to see happening more frequently. And I think the more of these discussions that happen, and the more alignment and understanding of the two parties, the sponsor and the agency, the more we will see in terms of less complexity, hopefully, or further alignment in drug development.
Yeah, and I want to say similarly that first of all, what Stacey's mentioned, when we hear about celebrities, it's one thing, but in my practice, I've had people, they're racing against literally every day against time for survival, so it's a real serious issue. But in terms of what they're getting right, I think FDA does deserve credit for, as my colleagues have said, accelerated approval pathways, breakthrough therapy designations, and these have meaningfully shortened timelines for rare disease patients who got really no other options. And it's also become more explicit that regulatory flexibility is appropriate, but not a waiver of rigor. Now, there's a couple of areas, maybe 2 or 3 areas where FDA falls short in providing this early binding clarity on endpoints and evidence standards. So, sponsors obviously invest years and hundreds of millions of dollars often, and that's based on informal feedback, which can actually shift between advisory meetings. So where the FDA is not yet, getting it right, one of the areas I think that is the consistency and operational simplicity. I also think that FDA is still not fully solved what I call the evidence problem for ultra small populations, as we've talked about. So patient heterogeneity and small trial populations, they do make the rare disease development scientifically hard in ways that the FDA's evidentiary standards and frameworks were not designed actually to handle. So we've got to figure out the flexibility piece for natural history data and real world evidence. I also do think that FDA has been slow to institutionalize some areas like non-animal and in silico methodologies, even though science has matured. So, as we work on advancing the non-animal testing frameworks within the agency, and we see that progress is being made. I'm not going to say there's no progress, but clearly there's more progress that needs to be made. And finally, I'll just say that, the rare disease community, needs the FDA to sort of function as a true development partner, not only as a gatekeeper. So the most successful programs that I've seen treat FDA alignment as a scientific strategy, not a compliance exercise.
All right. Thank you. Well, I was excited to see the non-animal models progress a little bit further a couple of weeks ago with new guidance from the FDA.
I think just from a sort of operational perspective, I think everything that the other panelists have said have actually been quite illustrative of all of the concerns and all of the issues. I think sort of from a operational perspective, the experience that we have noted is that the review staff doesn't know exactly what to do. So I always tell the FDA when we're in meetings with them that their job is way more difficult than mine, because they have to get through, as Dr. Gupta just said, dying patients, mothers crying over their children, horrible diseases on a daily, hourly basis. And they have to sift through that data, that information, of which the pathology of the disease and its consequences are really very clear, and yet decide whether the treatment in front of them for review meets our standards of safety and efficacy. And our standards as a country, not ours as an industry, obviously, as a regulatory body. That's an incredibly hard job. And they're trying to thread that needle, in the rare disease pathway, which, as Stacey just said so clearly, there's sometimes not enough patients to do a good randomized controlled trial. Timeframes are very attenuated, because, as she also spoke clearly about, the investment community drives a lot of our success and failures now, right? So in the old days of pharma, when Pfizer had a trial that failed of 8,000 patients, their stock went down, 75 cents or something like that, and the world went on. With a baby biotech, for instance, like Capricor, if we fail a trial, or the trial has to go a year longer, or we have to enroll more patients, you can lose 80% of your value in a single day, and then not be able to raise any more money. And so actually many good therapeutics have been put on a shelf because of that paradigm. So I always tell people, we're very lucky. We just hit our phase 3 trial with hitting our primary and all key secondary endpoints. It shows how powerful deramiocel is in treating Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But more importantly, we are looking at potentially 1/25th of that patient's life if their life is 25 years, 1/30th if they're living to 30 years, which some are doing now. That is very hard time frame in which to really see measurable change in a disease that definitely needs therapeutics. So I'm just cautioning people to look at clinical trial design and use natural history, because a lot of these diseases, people don't get better.
So what do you do about that, Linda? When it's only when a year can't really tell you enough, what do you do in that situation?
Like I said, we're very lucky because our data did. So I'm actually not speaking from experience of deramiocel at this point. But, I think that's, again, where everybody else on the panel has said, and where we need to continue to work with the agency. And I really hope for this collaboration to expand as we have more therapies for rare diseases come to fruition, as there's CRISPR therapeutics and individual therapies like baby KJ. How do you regulate around something like that? These are all issues that need to be explored, with time frame of clinical trials being able to be supplemented by natural history, by physician statements, by patient communities advocating, and mostly and absolutely most importantly, by safety of a therapeutic. Because in reality, efficacy matters, but safety matters more. And so, that is where sort of this right to try situation comes to fruition. And we certainly hope in Capricor, as we've got to know our Duchenne community and other rare disease communities, that patients and families have the opportunity to partake of a therapeutic or a treatment or a small molecule that can actually potentially make their child or family member better without causing any safety concerns.
Okay, thank you. Well, speaking of trial design, single pivotal trials, the FDA's recent kind of pivot. Let's talk about that. So, in this context, what is the most appropriate regulatory pathway for rare and especially ultra rare disease therapies? Linda or Matt, one of you guys want to start?
Yeah, so I'll start, Matt, if you don't mind.
Please.
I think there it's sort of like an answer that's a non-answer. I'm sorry, Heather, but there is no really well-defined pathway. I think we're still trying to figure that out think the agency is trying to figure out, and I alluded to in my previous comments, the review staff are given mandates as to what they need to look for in review, and they're all different hubs, non-clinical, CMC, clinical, stats, and their jobs, they're trained professionals to look at different aspects of a filing, and then basically for leadership to build it together into a approval pathway. And so there really needs to be individual attention and hopefully better collaboration as time rolls forward. One thing, you asked in your first question, what's different now between 2 to 5 years ago? The difference now is that access to the agency has been attenuated. And I don't know if other people have experienced this, but we used to have open dialogues and many informal meetings in our path forward where we would be able to tailor what we were doing clinically and from a regulatory perspective based on direct feedback. This now sort of reverted back to the old days of request a meeting and wait for the time and get the meeting, and it's very formal. And that doesn't necessarily work very well in rare and ultra rare diseases because you're not doing an 8,000 patient hypertension trial with very clear deliverables or endpoints, not only deliverables. So Matt, I don't know if you want to add any color to that or have a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said, Linda. So I think there's not one best path for everybody. I think the fact that we have multiple paths is a very positive thing, and I think it's the onus of the sponsor of the company to understand what's best given their data, given their patient population, given the endpoints, the natural history data that they have to decide what's the best path forward. Accelerated approval may be quicker to a decision, but then you also then need to understand what's the best way to run a confirmatory trial and what are those endpoints and what's that data. And so, maybe accelerated approval may not be the best path. In other cases, doing full approval and having the clinical data necessary to put together may be an easier route. So I think behind your question, for me, I think it raises sort of the importance of that early and explicit alignment with the FDA, and to be really clear and upfront on the endpoints and the analysis and what constitutes that complete package for approval, be it accelerated or traditional approval early in the game. All right, this is something you can't sort of retrofit or try to straddle the fence and pivot at the last minute because there's maybe not internal alignment on what's your path forward. I think that's where companies can get themselves into trouble. The fact that there are all these two pathways is great, and it's a little bit of understanding what is the best path for you given your data, your population, and then start having those questions and discussions on what good looks like with the agency so you can get clarity and there's no surprises late in the game.
Okay. Are there benefits of a single trial policy for rare disease drug developers?
Yeah, Heather, I'd like to just add on to that. This is a really positive signal, but it's not new, and there are several great examples where a single pivotal trial was able to provide evidence to support the approval of a rare disease product. And so it's a really positive signal, but one word of, I think, caution as we move forward, towards this as an idea and a practice, that in rare disease, because of the inherent challenges, and we've talked about a lot of them, we need to have the understanding that expectation for a single perfect trial is going to be too high of a bar for many rare diseases because our learnings of the disease, particularly if it's an area where there is little precedent, little experience, maybe you're operating with again, a novel endpoint, you're going to learn about that endpoint about after the selection of it as you go along. And so we talk about early and often dialogue. It also has to be continuous, iterative dialogue. And just the expectations around a single pivotal trial, we need to recognize that there may not be that perfect trial in rare disease. It doesn't mean that those data aren't interpretable. It doesn't mean they can't provide meaningful insight into whether your therapy is going to deliver a clinical benefit. So I think the key is that we need to evaluate it in the entire context of all of the evidence. So that's real world data, that's looking at biomarkers, particularly when we have a really strong understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of the disease and how our product works on that. So it's really about a totality of evidence approach and recognizing that even in circumstances where that single pivotal trial isn't going to yield, statistically significant results, we can still find things that are interpretable and meaningful and bring about that new option for patients.
Okay.
I completely agree with everything Stacey said. It's really sort of a redefinition of rigor, right? It's no longer is one trial enough, but it has to be, is the overall evidence package, sufficiently robust and coherent, and is that enough? Because you can't just put all of your weight on the pivotal trial itself. Because in rare disease, you are learning, you're building in some of that, natural history data, you're understanding that patient population, that heterogeneity of the disease, what are the critical endpoints, what are the necessary biomarkers, or how to effectively contextualize sort of a treatment effect. And so to me, I think just the focus of where you're looking changes. The standards don't change, but it's moving away from just a history of just repetition, showing the same result in two trials, to looking sort of broader at a package of data or totality of evidence, to ensure that the drug is safe and efficacious for patients.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing there, and maybe this sounds, a little bit, a little crass, but I'm just going to say it anyway. There's huge investment implications in 1 versus 2 pivotal trials, and it can really change. And I think that we as a biotech community and world have to acknowledge the fact that we are very dependent on investors to believe in our technologies, to invest in them, and then to allow us to move forward. And drug development is becoming increasingly more expensive. So if you think of, I don't know the average cost, but let's just say a pivotal trial in a rare disease is somewhere between $20 and $50 million. Times 2 is a lot more investment and a lot more time that a company has to, or sponsor has to stay afloat. So I think that, you have to integrate that in, and that really can give some great energy to the investment space if we have a total package that is based on rigor, as our colleagues on this panel just said, but in addition to that, recognizing that there's an infusion of capital that's necessary to move these programs forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think it just quickly, Heather, I think it's important just to acknowledge this is one the FDA got right. Right.
Yeah.
And they should get, the kudos for that. Stacey mentioned it. This is sort of where practice was going anyways, and to formalize it. I know we got approval with the FDA for 1 trial in our phase 3, prior to the now famous, New England Journal of Medicine article when it came out. And so I think, majority of drugs were moving down this path. And I think this helps now with alignment and sort of with that communication that they're formalizing, this process.
Rahul, I wanted to ask you, I think this is an important question, especially for trial design. How can AI help?
Although that's exactly, listen to my colleagues saying, a single pivotal trial, 20 to 50 million, as well as time spent versus 2. So, when you're talking about, let's say, conceptually putting all your eggs in one basket, there's a potential to put all your eggs, if not at least 2 more eggs in that basket, which is, AI can be a very useful tool in that single pivotal trial, but only if it's used to make trial more targeted, more efficient, and more explainable rather than more mysterious. So when we leverage AI in trial design, that includes things like adaptive design, synthetic control arms, and predictive patient stratification, that can substantially de-risk for the investor community as well as for the outcomes purposes that single pivotal trial. So that's exactly what JTC held is central to how we're thinking about a development strategy. Sponsors that are pursuing single trials pathways should front load FDA engagement. I mean, I think the regulatory risk is in the trial itself, but it's in misaligned expectations about what the trial needs to prove. So what I would say is, like, if the idea here is to avoid any decision day surprises, at the end, it's not about showing up to NDA or BLA and saying, well, we used quote unquote AI to answer questions in the trial. It's actually defining and designing that trial ahead of time, so that and you're sort of going according to the FDA's draft AI draft guidance already that's out there. And so I think it's a huge, to answer your question, Heather, it helps us a lot get there.
Thanks, Rahul.
100%.
All right. Well, let's talk about some trends in terms of successful and unsuccessful candidates in 2025 and 2026. What are some takeaways, Stacy?
Yeah, sure. I think it's top of mind. Yesterday, the FDA approved the therapy developed by Denali and Hunter syndrome. And for those who aren't aware, it's a very serious disease, and this treatment, was very important for the patient community. So very exciting to see. And it was approved via the accelerated approval pathway, which is of note. And the surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit, heparan sulfate, has been, the subject of debate. I think other companies are looking at using forms of heparan sulfate for approval based on a surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And so I think it's notable. I think that approval was a very positive sign, perhaps breaking what has been a recent streak of CRLs issued, or companies perhaps receiving different guidance about the availability of the accelerated approval pathway. So I think for my trend, that's one that I would focus on. And accelerated approval as a pathway, just for context, is absolutely crucial in the rare disease developer community because, as we've noted, many of these diseases are serious, life-threatening, irreversibly progressive. Patients don't have time to wait. And some of them, are not immediately progressive. So measuring a clinical benefit in a reasonable time frame is infeasible. It's why Congress created the accelerated approval pathway and codified its use in rare disease. And so it's just really important that we continue to see progress. It's historically been used very well in oncology, where you can measure, for example, tumor size, and we understand really well how that relates to clinical outcomes like survival. And so there's a really important role to continue to use accelerated approval more in rare disease, particularly, as I said earlier, in those cases where we have a really strong understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of the disease and how the biomarker could measure changes in that. So that would be my trend, that there have been, a series of setbacks that I think have started to shake confidence in the investor and the kind of company community about whether the pathway remains a viable option. And hopefully yesterday is a positive signal that we will get back on track.
Anybody else have a trend?
Yeah, so I thought that Stacy's comments about accelerated approval is very interesting. I think if you talk to families in the rare disease community, they sometimes feel frustrated by that pathway, and the opposite way, because they believe in the biomarker and then they want to see the confirmatory confirm the results of the biomarker trial, right? Because somebody with the disease, the biomarker is not necessarily attenuation of symptoms. Now, in Hunter syndrome, obviously, it's very different, right? Of course, that biomarker is going to be incredibly impactful in probably how patients feel, function, and survive. But there's others in which it becomes a little bit less easy to draw the line between that biomarker and, feels, function, and survives, functional ability. So I'll just say that from the accelerated pathway, not that I'm not completely in favor of it. I think that the trends from 25 to 26 are that it appears that the FDA is calming down a little bit, that they are They went through a big shakeup in 25 where there were a lot of people let go. They changed their whole approach on adcoms, where they got rid of sort of that external body review. They're trying out different versions of AI. There was a lot of things that happened administratively that probably changed review processes. It feels to me anyway, and with Capricorn 2026, that things are settling down, that some of those changes that Dr. Gupta spoke so clearly about at the beginning are starting to see the light. And now what we have to do, and what I've said as I traverse around Washington and talk to different legislators as we talk about deramiocel and its particular path forward, is we need to see the review community or the review teams begin to reflect what Dr. Makary has been saying in public media about single pivotal trials, CMC changes, the plausible mechanism pathway, and some of the other so groundbreaking and exciting paths forward, as opposed to sort of the clinical dogma of how it's been in the past. And so we're excited about 26 and to see these things come to fruition.
Okay, well, so next question. You guys have talked a lot so far about communication. How can the FDA and the EMA, who have, how can the FDA and biopharma companies be clear in their communications, from on both sides?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it's you see all the news and therapies not being approved, and I don't think that's because there's disagreement. I think a lot of that happens because there's misinterpretation or misalignment in the discussions between sponsors and the agency, and obviously that happens on both sides. And I think from an FDA perspective, greater transparency and consistency, I think even more so, would have a huge impact. Clear articulation of what that evidentiary threshold is, especially around surrogate endpoints and external controls. What's the definition of clinically meaningful benefit, and try to have alignment on that. And then I think one thing that we're starting to see as therapies become more complex and some of these new technologies is they no longer fit into a nice, neat bucket of one single division. And a lot of these drugs now span multiple divisions. And ensuring that we have consistency across divisions, I think, is becoming more and more important, and that we can sort of have a similar view or similar expectation from the agency independently of where it's being reviewed. I think from the industry side, I think just discipline in that communication, separating kind of the data from the interpretation, and to avoid overextending early signals, and to align kind of as an organization on what the internal and the external narratives are, because that misalignment can quickly show up in FDA interactions and cause misalignment down the road. And then that just continuous dialogue, right? I think you have to approach the agency rather than just sort of one-offs or at individual moments, but as a continuous dialogue, and to sort of start that early and have those discussions in between the formal meetings, so you understand where the uncertainties are and where the trade-offs are going to be for your program. And I think that really helps with resourcing. It helps with capitalization, and also helps with sort of timelines. So you're not sort of pivoting en route, which can create a lot of delays in the development of new drugs.
Okay, thank you. Linda, you've had some recent conversations with the FDA surrounding deramiocel. What has your experience been? What was good? What could have been better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because I was listening to Matt and sort of thinking about this next question. I think that the most important thing is what I said a few minutes ago, which is that there needs to be a trickle-down effect from what leadership is saying externally, and what Stacy talked about a little bit ago about the investment community really needing that sort of driving force of continuity, predictability. If this happens, then that happens. To sort of keep the whole industry going. And I think that The review staff is still struggling, at least in my opinion, to figure out what leadership is really telling them to do, because in their mandates, they have to have very strict criteria for review in terms of statistical significance, in terms of statistical analyses, clinical data collection, manifestation, that kind of thing, and all of the different pathways. And so they are not, there doesn't seem to be a really good coalescence between what the review staff is being told to do or are responding with and what leadership is saying. So we think that that's been addressed. We feel very confident in moving deramiocel to PDUFA. We have a new PDUFA date. They accepted our response to the complete response. The data has been submitted. We've had an active dialogue since the submission of that data package, all which seems moving in the right direction at this point. So I think that's going to be improved in the current year, and we look forward to reporting good results on improved communications with the agency this year.
All right. Thanks, Linda. One question I want to make sure that we get to. External controls have been in the news lately with the whole situation around Unicure. For those who aren't familiar, the FDA recently told Unicure that the data from their phase 1/2 trial compared to a natural history study would not be enough for a BLA submission. So what is this is for everyone. What is your understanding of the FDA's position on external controls, and how can companies plan accordingly?
So I'm going to just in
Okay, yes.
because just that really played right into what I said before. This is exactly what I was alluding to, which is that leadership is talking a lot about natural history, real world evidence, all of the abilities to use those data sets clearly to define the pathogenesis of a disease process as compared to some kind of a treatment paradigm. I actually think it's a fabulous way of utilizing data from a patient population without putting them through a clinical trial. That doesn't seem to be translating down well into the review staff, at least at this point. That was one of the major issues raised in our complete response letter, which was issued in July of 2025, was that we were using a natural history data set collected, funded by the FDA, and published in major academic journals, that was not enough to support the approval of deramiocel for DMD cardiomyopathy. That's why we gave them the HOPE-3 data. So I think that it's a pathway that's been talked about a lot. I think we all love it. I'm sure nobody on this panel or signed in the world would say that it's not a great strategy. I'd love to understand sort of why these companies and sponsors have been turned down based on their real world evidence data when it seems such a clear path forward.
Thank you. What about you, Stacy?
Yeah, thank you. I think just generally, right, it's just about making sure that our mindset is one that external controls don't represent a lower standard and that they, in fact, are representing gold standard science and really shouldn't be used as a fallback when randomization fails or isn't feasible, but rather something that may provide us more and better information than we can get with randomization in these settings. I mean, we've talked about small patient populations. I think, some of the examples recently, the ethical considerations that are associated when sometimes you need to have perhaps a sham control would be, suggested as part of randomization. In those cases, it can be difficult or infeasible to enroll your trial, particularly if you are operating in one of those diseases where there's either therapeutic alternatives or investigational alternatives. So, at the same time, and I'm sure my fellow panelists can speak much more eloquently to this than I can, but our statistical methods that we can use to bolster the kind of alternatives and external controls have gotten to the point where, propensity score matching, some of our Bayesian methods, we can construct external controls that are really able to deliver results that may be more reproducible and interpretable than what you get from an RCT in the same condition. So again, I think as sponsors, our goal is really just to select the design that has the best potential to demonstrate what we're looking for out of the therapy, while also minimizing unnecessary burden, with things like, sham procedures to the extent possible for the patients that we serve.
Okay, thank you. This
Yeah.
might be, oh, sorry, go right ahead.
I was just very briefly going to say is that FDA has consistently said that external or natural history controls can support approval, especially in rare diseases. So, but only when they're fit for purpose and sufficiently reliable. So, if questions what's changed is that the level of scrutiny around whether they truly meet that bar is what's changed.
Okay. This might be a very good time to get to our first question. So this is again around the Huntington's and Unicure decision. Are we seeing FDA improve an improved understanding at the FDA of the urgency and accepting that fatal neurodegenerative diseases shouldn't be ethically bound to placebo arms, and that decentralized trials that can track endpoints remotely, for example, should be the minimally standard approach for what a patient-centric, inclusive trial looks like? Throw that out to anyone.
So I think that that goes along exactly what Dr. Gupta was saying is sort of, are they fit for purpose, and are these, natural history controls or external data done in a way that's reproducible, that you can source data back, that it is something that is rigorous, and would be acceptable. And as Stacy was saying, you can use statistical methods to build your plan around either its propensity matching or other that will give you a strong result. I think everybody is for reducing the burden on patients that are entering these trials, reducing the time of these trials and what it would take to get drugs approved for some of these fatal neurodegenerative diseases or diseases that affect babies and infants. And so I think this is all about having those right external controls, right natural history, and building that into your development plan of a drug, and working with folks at the NIH or working with folks at some of the top academic research institutions we have to help develop this data, which is just as important as developing some of the clinical data that the company is running in the clinical trials.
And I'll just second that to what Matt said, but answer it in an AI context also. The FDA's position is like, when you're using approaches like digital twins or historical data derived controls, the running into trouble is not the philosophy, it's actually the credibility. So, are the patients, whether it's AI generated or otherwise, are truly comparable? Is the data complete, consistently collected? And can you rule out bias? And those type of things would become more important. Even their AI policy is more about, getting away from just, like very theoretical science to actual reproducible and reliable science in AI as well.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that, in response to the RDCC does not represent the company that was named in the question, and I don't, of course, have all of the details about the back and forth and what ultimately led to, the current where the product application currently lies. But that said, it would seem that one case can't be representative at this stage of a trend. And I think going back to FDA's guidance, I'm not exactly sure when it was promulgated, but that guidance did talk about how there are going to be certain cases in neurodegenerative diseases where sham control or RCT is going to be the only feasible approach. So I wouldn't see this necessarily as a departure. And to echo, I think the comments from my fellow panelists that we would hope to see a continued patient-centric approach that really avoids these more burdensome approaches to the greatest extent possible by using alternatives.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Another question that came in, is there any word on CPIM's ability to keep up with the submissions and reviews of new letters of intent for new drug development tools at CDER? It seems this program, though PDUFA funded, continues to be under-resourced and delayed compared with CBER. Now, for any listeners who are unfamiliar with the CPIM program, this is CDER's Critical Path Innovations meetings, and they're a non-regulatory forum used to discuss innovative methodologies or technologies aimed at improving drug development. Matthew, you commented earlier in the discussion today about the science outpacing the regulation. This is essentially a pathway to help do that, and it's a part of CDER's engagement with the industry. Does anyone have any insights into this process, Matthew?
Yeah, I don't have any direct experience with this pathway, but I think again, this shows ways to try to accelerate drugs and try to improve those dialogues between sponsors and industry, which ultimately is very positive. And I think you see that aspects of this materializing in different ways. We saw recently the single patient approval pathway for gene editing and rare disease, which is really high science and sort of doesn't necessarily fit into the agency mold for an approvable drug. So I think programs like these are positive. We all know there are organizational challenges, with the agency, and things seem to hopefully have settled down. And some of the delays that we had seen prior, seem to have reconciled and are on a better trajectory, and hopefully that continues, for programs like this.
I'm going to ask you guys one more question, maybe to end on, and this might be a bit of a toughie, but what is the hardest thing about following FDA regulations?
I think I'll just start there. I think the hardest thing is really knowing what those regulations are asking for. So when you are designing clinical trials, implementing clinical trials, dealing with data in real time from real people and the normal things that happened in trial implementation and execution, we try as hard as we can as sponsors to follow all of the regulations. Obviously, we hire consulting firms and leaders and all kinds of people, pundits and former FDA employees to help us, navigate those relatively complicated waters. But in reality, it's just trying to figure out how to fit real data from real trials into a regulatory paradigm. And that's all on the clinical side. It's on the CMC side. It's on the non-clinical side. The regulations are sort of straw men for what we have to do, and we have to sort of color in and hope that we're doing it the right way.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Gupta.
I'm just going to say that, look, make it very simple. Some of the easiest things is, you go to the DMV and get your driver's license, right? All things are very clear. Although even that is difficult for some. Now, here's the directionally opposite of that. And the way to sort of help that, as Linda mentioned, it's just the opposite of that, right? So to help to create sort of a non-black box system could be for the FDA to figure out how to make it simpler, more transparent, and easier, especially for smaller companies, to level the playing field. Which is so you don't have to go to a ton of consultants out there. So maybe there's a way of putting information online, maybe in a de-identified way, of what worked and what didn't work. All of these things and all the regulatory decisions, I think there's ways of making it simple where people, they may not have the very straight line, but actually they can learn on to figure out what mistakes not to make moving forward. So I do think there's some improvement to be made in the future, but it's in the interest of helping get, again, the smaller companies and the investors and moving things forward so that it creates a level playing field.
And I would just add that there is a bit of intention in the ambiguity, I imagine, in the guidance that's available to us as sponsors. And I think the difficult but also exciting part is in that rare disease, we often are operating in those ambiguous spaces because if FDA were to be too prescriptive in its guidance, it would be limiting and counter to our goals as sponsors. And so, that I think is an important point that you know, following guidance that has appropriate, and I hate the term flexibility because statute is very clear that these tools that FDA uses aren't really flexibility. They're well within the parameters of the substantial evidence standard or meeting that standard and their statutory tools. But for FDA to exercise those fit for purpose tools or those flexibilities, it really requires that guidance be sufficiently flexible and not prescriptive. And, we talk a lot about consistency in FDA's approach, but that's also something we have a degree of wariness about as sponsors as well, because every single rare disease is different, and there are even different subsets within those diseases that demand us to take a very disease-specific view of each product application and consider it in the whole context of that disease.
Thanks.
And if I can just add in the last kind of couple seconds here, Heather, I think taking it in another direction, I think sometimes explaining to patients in the communities those regulations and why things kind of have to take on a certain path and take certain time is tough, right? They're asking us to move as fast as we can and to get drugs approved for their diseases and to bring hope to the communities. But we have to work within the regulatory framework. And sometimes just explaining that for somebody who doesn't sort of live it and breathe it day to day is often the toughest part.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank all of our panelists today for an excellent conversation. I think we've unpacked a lot, and thank all of you for joining us today for this discussion.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's been delightful.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks.